Mm.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and another interesting day. And with the outcome of the federal election apparent, I think it's appropriate that this is what we look at. Our guest from Victoria, Judy Auchterlonie. Welcome, Judy.
Thanks, Arnie. Hello.
No worries. And Beata Luks from Adelaide. Welcome, Beata.
Good morning, all.
Okay. Now, I chose the title for today's forum, Analysing the Political Narrative, and I think it's important because we each take an assessment, if you like, of the outcome of the election. And I think each person's view is really, really important because it's essentially their interpretation of the narrative. I'm going to ask Beata to give her view of what she sees the result meaning to her. Beata.
Oh, wow. It was a relief to start with because uh, there was a lot of time spent on producing all sorts of experts to convince us one way or the other um, about the benefits and or dangers of doing or not doing certain things. And it's funny because last night I discovered that when the television came on, and it was quite popular in America, after a little time, there was a English government deciding that everyone must have a set in England. So what they did, they sent all the reconditioned old TVs from America to England, and they put it in everyone's house. And then, of course, they were going with the collection box every week, getting pennies for paying off this rented TV. And everyone got so used to it that the speaker whom I listened to was saying that when he was a little boy, the family would go for a walk in the morning or middle afternoon or whatever to this park in a valley where every family with their children would be, and people were exchanging ideas, were talking about difficult times, were offering help, and they were bound together as community,
Hmm.
and they were very much on top of everything. And then one day there was nobody in the park, and TVs were blazing in
Hmm.
every living room.
Mm.
It's a very sad story, but you
Mm.
can see how the governments think about our happiness,
Mm.
and they orchestrate everything for
Mm.
us.
That's fascinating.
So,
That's a fascinating analysis. Thank you for that, Beata. Judy, your take on the election and the election outcome.
Um, I was pleased Sunday morning when I realised Scott Morrison had been successful because I was not looking forward to what the Labor Party had insisted they would do, that we needed to have done. Very socialist, very Marxist um, ideas and policies that they had, and I think that is why Australians voted against them partly. But of course, I know in the long run we are still having socialist Marxist policies inflicted on us, even though we have a Liberal National Party government. That does the government in charge does not change the end result. I accept that. But yes, I had momentary happiness Sunday morning to realise that I wasn't going to have to look at Bill Shorten and his cheesy grin. And
Okay.
I guess he's probably I feel sorry for him because he's been used badly, but
Mm.
he seemed to be happy about that.
Okay.
Powers, the will to powers.
It's tempting, isn't it?
Terrific.
The will to
Terrific.
power is tempting. That's right.
Oh,
And
yes.
and the thing is that I think in one of the recent on targets I made mention that unbridled power cannot operate in a moral and ethical vacuum. It has to be held responsible and has to be held
Mm.
moral. And if it's neither, then of course it's tyranny.
Yeah.
Well, my take on the election is basically that I think we've got a guaranteed continuation of more of the same, and that is more of the same socialist policies, more of the same centralist policies, more of the same progressive and further increasing taxation, more of the same United Nations legislation imposing over us, more of the same loss of our sovereignty, more of the same massive immigration, in fact, continuing to
Yeah.
expand. I think that surfaced not that long before the election that the numbers that the Conservative government was saying was 160,000 per annum, but in actual fact, the real number is closer to
Yeah.
260,000, 270,000. So, of course, the more we're going to have more of the same, and this is where I think Beata's observation is most profound. The narrative, the actual medium of television. First, I think TV was discovered or uncovered or developed in the 1920s, but it wasn't released until the 1950s into the United States as a means of everyone hearing the same narrative. And that's what we saw, I believe. That's what we saw. And I've already been described as being jaded and bitter and twisted about the election result, but and they're my words, and they're certainly embellished. But I'll leave it on the table just for the fun of it. I believe that the narrative that was played out in the election campaign, the orchestration of Clive Palmer, his anti-Labor position, the fact that Bob Brown came out of nowhere to
Mm.
demonstrate to the Queenslanders that the Queenslanders can't get to do what the Queenslanders want to do, whether they want to do it or not. I've seen that happen where an individual, and it was me at the time, challenged a group of people that I felt that they were wrong on a particular issue, and what it did was it consolidated those people into a single position. And I believe Bob Brown's event in for the Adani mine consolidated the Queenslanders into a position that was mind your own bloody business, Bob Brown, and you stay out of what we decide to do. We'll do what we want, and that's it. And so I think the narrative was fascinating because I think the single narrative coming from all streams of media was the same. Liberals are solid, they're conservative, you know what you're getting. You have the great unknown coming from the great unwashed, and that you're risking everything. And so out of fear, people have gone to back to the Conservatives, away from Labor. And it's even fascinating that the polls were about consistently reading about 4% of the vote wrong. And I think that even that narrative smells. I smell a rat. I smell a rat. That what it's doing is it's people are not convinced sufficiently to protect the Conservative government. We're going to herd them away and make sure that they do consolidate the Conservative government. And that's exactly what the outcome has been. So maybe I am jaded, bitter, and twisted, and I'll live with that. But that's my analysis of what's going on. I am seriously concerned. I believe that we as a nation are being subjected to enormous psychological, political
Mm.
warfare, and that the medium that they're using is the TV. Your thoughts again, Beata.
Oh, yes. The number of very young, suspiciously young specialists and such, and commentators, of course, is not a surprise, um, because that agenda, that grand design is going on.
Hmm.
Um, yes, and speaking of politicians, there is also a group of bureaucrats behind them, and
Hmm.
that never changes. So
Hmm.
even if the policy changes slightly, the bureaucrats are not likely to implement it very quickly because they don't like the change either.
Hmm.
So it's forever. We are forever between the anvil and the hammer, aren't we?
Hmm. Hmm. A very good analysis, Beata. I think it's fascinating that that with the Joyce Qantas CEO essentially bullying people, and then of course
Yeah.
Israel
Wow.
Falou, the rugby player, being bullied. You can't have these opinions. You certainly can't express them, and it will affect your employment tenure. Now, what the dickens has got what you do in your private life got to do with business? What's it got to do with it? It's none of their business, but they're in there and they're dominating and they're bullying and essentially becoming the fascist in charge. And I think it's fascinating that the silence coming from the pulpit. Now, I read the other day Bernard Gaynor's website the other day of what if you like, the CEO of the Catholic Church in Australia, the Archbishop, and what he did say, essentially that Christianity is history. It's a past. It's gone. Its use by date is over. And I'm thinking, they're my words, not his. Go to Bernard's website and have a look. But that was the take that I got from it, and I thought Bernard's exactly right. If he was in charge of rugby and he said that rugby is finished, it's got a use by date, it's all over Red Rover, he'd be sacked. AFL the same. If Joyce was the same with Qantas, he'd be sacked on the spot. But here it is, the leader of a church who's supposed to assist and identify bringing about God's kingdom on earth is incapable of even offering a response. And I'm thinking, this guy here is lacking something, seriously lacking something. It's not confidence. I believe what it is it's a belief, a presence of the Holy Spirit in his life. I believe that it's not there. I don't think
No.
I don't think he's an outworking Christian. And I think that any person who's calling themselves a Christian, surely it has to be in the outworking of their life. It's got to be in the things that they bring about in earth as in heaven. You can't pray it every day. You can't pray it every day without putting it into action. And I think there's such a warning Jesus gives us with the virgins and their oil, their lamps
Yeah.
half full of oil. That oil depicting the Holy Spirit, it's only half full. It's not full to the brim and running over. My God is more than enough. It's not. And the denarius, what did they do with the denarius? They buried it. They should have gone out and put it to work, and they haven't. And that to me is quite a sadness. And it really is an indictment against the leadership in the church that they can't respond to the issues of the day. What relevance do they have? Anyway, that's me. I'm bitter and twisted and jaded today. I'm not confident of the future. I think that the outcome, while some people are having a sigh of relief, I'm more concerned than ever because they are placing their faith into the hands of a man instead of placing their faith into the hands of God alone and bringing about God's kingdom. And if they sit on their laurels, there's every chance Australia will be lost. Judy.
Oh, yes, Arnie. I have to agree with you that I was lost my train of thought. thought then the what we've seen happening, what we're seeing happening is that Bob Hawke, in his famous speech to the Fabian Society, talked about gradualism for socialism. That's what we're seeing. Gradually, little freedoms are being eroded. Someone gets sacked from his job because he put a post on somewhere from the Bible, which people didn't like. Um, all those little things, all our freedoms, more taxation. I know things are not going to get necessarily better with the change of government or those people that run the government anyway. As Beata said, the bureaucrats are very powerful. But I try and be optimistic and I try and do things which might help persuade a politician to think differently. And when I talk to people, I try and just sort of prompt their thinking, maybe there's another reason for this. I try and be optimistic, Arnie, and not necessarily use a sense of humour, but just try not to let it get me down too much, I guess, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you for that, Judy. I'll take that into account, and I'll consider it. I'll mull over it. I'll mull over it because you have to. You can't. In a sense, I sort of look on this well inside of me, and I have a passion and a love for my country and the future. I hope a future that's worth pursuing for our children, for my children and your children, not just my children, not just selfishly, but for everyone's children, the generations to come. Income tax is less than 100 years old. Federal income tax. It was unheard of. It was brought in as I think it was a necessity or a temporary thing for the First World War. It, and it's got to the stage where it is so encroaching to the point where you've gone through more than half a year before you even surface that the money is your own. It's got to this gradual encroachment, and the thing is that it's not getting any less. When Keating introduced the superannuation, compulsory superannuation, it wasn't undone, it wasn't deconstructed, it continued on. In actual fact, what's Peter Costello? Future Fund. I mean, come on, this is all part of the narrative. They're in there together. They're exactly the same. They're just good cop, bad cop. And I get quite frustrated in it because I think, okay, Australia's going to take a sigh of relief. We're okay. We've got the Liberals back in. And I'm saying, no, we're not. We are not okay. They are all revolutionaries. They are all totalitarians. And Scott Morrison can put his hands up in church and he can do whatever he likes. But if I don't see a change in policy, then his Christianity is worth naught. If I don't see the fact that Fallu can actually speak his mind and be entitled to have an actual expression of his religious beliefs without being threatened with his job security, and if Joyce doesn't back off, if these things don't actually transpire, then the government that we've got is equally totalitarian. And I think that the actual hardline campaign that Labor took in this election was to ensure the re-election of the Conservative government. So put that on the table. That's what I think. And as hard as that sounds, that is what I think. Anyway, Beata.
Yes, well, that might put everyone in the cruise mode and think, oh, phew, nothing changes.
Right.
Yes. But you have forgotten to mention GST. That's another tax we are paying on top of every other tax. And no matter how much the price of crude oil drops, we're still paying so much for the petrol, for example, because, well, the government is not going to forgo its taxes, is it? So yes, it's really sad. What do the Conservatives do? Well, they give us a bit of hope, or go and list things that are speaking to common sense. Yes, but how about the implementation? Yes, the agenda is going on. I'm convinced of that too, unfortunately.
Judy.
It was sorry, one more thing. It was interesting to notice on the ballot paper there were 6 names on the green paper, all women, and of course it was Kevin Rudd who implemented the quote for women politicians, didn't he? He was the first one, wasn't he? And then we had wonderful Julia Gillard. And now there were only women on the ballot paper.
That was in our electorate. That's right.
Yeah,
Kingston, I think. Yeah. That was interesting to see that. Yeah.
All women.
I think that the ballot paper actually obviously caters. It obviously caters for the thinking their analysis of the thinking in each electorate. And no doubt the now what do you call it? It's a slush fund. It's something anyway. It's essentially a war chest going into an electoral campaign that the spending for each electorate, especially if it's a critical electorate, goes up. And so it's oh well, we're going to get more from this particular branch of the government than the other particular branch, whether it's Liberal or Labor. And so it's essentially the individual is accepting a bribe. I will get more from this one than that one. And it's we have to actually look a little bit harder than that. If there's to be a future, we've got to stop accepting the bribes and we've got to start thinking about how do we actually deconstruct this behemoth, this totalitarian behemoth. How do we deconstruct it? Is Scott Morrison part of the answer? I don't believe so. Are the Liberals part of the answer? I don't believe so. I believe the answer is actually you. It's you and I. It's actually choosing to get so involved and make life so darn uncomfortable for these politicians that they start to think about change in policy. Now, the climate policy was certainly prominent on the agenda for this election, and it appears that that even the, if you like, the crossbench won't be successful in dominating the Conservative government in regard to climate. But then that you've got to ask the question. You've got to ask the question: is will the Conservative government, seeing as they do have a clear majority in the Parliament, will they deconstruct this madness, this climate change, electrical madness that's before us? Will they deconstruct it so that we've got stable baseload, so that we use the natural resources that we have and it costs us the least amount so that there's no significant punishment to our economy? And will they turn around and implement things where they actually produce a future for the next generation? I mean, if they're mortgaged to the hilt, student loans to the hilt, these are all outcomes of both branches of government, both Liberal and Labor. Mortgage to the hilt, student loans to the hilt, no job security because of the Lima Declaration, handing over industry to third world nations. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave our children? Now, this is both branches of government, Liberal and Labor, both the same, both the same. Judy.
I thought before, Arnie, of that verse from the Bible which says, by their fruits you will know them, and that's something we can keep an eye on. Well, that's, you just explained it, their behaviour, their policies. We can see what they are, and sadly, as you said earlier, the church may be happy to see a Christian prime minister, and I wouldn't say I was unhappy about that, but just how much will he use? Be able to use, because he's not necessarily under, he's under the control of others much of the time. How much he can use his faith to implement things which we want. And the church is, they're so strangely silent. They're so strangely silent. Now, I know a lot of prayer went up for the election result, and I suspect they'll all think, oh, the job's done now, we can go and do something else. But now they need more prayer than ever to try and turn things around and motivate our politicians to listen to us and motivate each other. And as like we say, as individuals, it's up to us. The buck stops with us on this.
I believe that's exactly right, Judy. The buck stops with us. If Australia stands or falls, it's on the individual Australians, one at a time, as to whether they choose to stand and let's try and rebuild, let's try and fix this up, because the narrative, the political narrative, is world government.
Yes.
Closing comments, Beata.
There is much work to do, of course, with talking to other people, to point out to the dangers of all sorts of policies, not least of which would be 5G, GMOs, abortion clinics everywhere, all sorts of subjects that are close to the heart of the family people. It's something that needs to be brought up, discussed, and so shut the TV down, or better still, throw it from the balcony.
We'll loan you our balcony, yes.
And start thinking about the next day, because it's up to you.
Beautiful, thank you, Beata. Closing comments, Judy.
I don't know that I've got anything to add, Arnie. We have to start today. We have to accept our responsibility, and as you say, accept that nothing much will change. Nothing much at all. Just because we've had a change of political party.
That's right.
We're still on the same downhill slide, and we have to arrest it.
Exactly right, Judy. And I agree with your analysis. And am I less jaded? Perhaps not. I think perhaps I am a little. I think you girls have calmed me a bit, but I'm not confident of the future. I'm not confident unless as I go out there and I see people and I see them standing up and, if you like, bringing their politicians to heel. Bringing their politicians to heel, because I'm of the view that the tyrants in charge are still there, and they're still going to continue on with the same policy. And the interesting part is that I think it was in an analysis of the Russian leader Putin and the Chinese leader that Trump is so, if you like, so unstable or so irrational or painted in such a negative light that people will be looking to the Soviet Union and Communist China as their savior. That's the picture that I'm painting politically. That we are looking towards a centralist government as our savior from those hardline communists in the Labor Party. And I'm of the view they're both revolutionaries. They're both totalitarian, and they're both taking us in the same direction, and that is world government. World government, world tyranny through the United Nations, through central banks. And what was it, the last day of Parliament? The Conservative government passed the GMO laws to allow seeds, to allow animals, to allow whatever. They passed it. And that's all about monopoly. That's all about controlling the world's food supply. This is our Conservative government. This is where they're taking us, and they will continue to take us. So don't be deluded. I'm not. The fight is on, and it's up to us. One at a time, individuals standing up for our freedoms. Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Thank you very much, ladies. Sorry if I've been bitter and twisted. I've loved every minute of it.
You look good. You've done well.